Hello, and welcome to the History 514 Week 4 lecture on Medieval Islamic Science and Medicine. Let me show you then the outline for today's lecture. And as you can see, we're going to actually spend a fair amount of time on the historical context that leads to the rise and then the spread of Islam. And we're going to pay a lot of attention to geography as well, the placement of the Islamic empires in relation to uh, Rome or I should say after the fall of Rome, looking at what happens following the fall of Rome, and then where Islam is in relation to that, and then its impact throughout the Mediterranean world and as far as spreading as far east as India, or at least the Indus Valley. Then we're going to turn to Islamic science and medicine itself, particularly looking at Baghdad as an incredibly important center for translations of Greek works as well as innovations that are added onto the sort of Greek basis of natural philosophy and medicine. And then we're going to look at what's termed the Eastern Caliphate and the Western Caliphate of the Islamic empires. Caliphate is basically the Arabic word for empire of sorts. I should say a caliph, who is the person who heads a caliphate, is actually the Arabic word for deputy. So it's sort of the deputized area that the deputy rules over. I'll talk about that more with the rise of Islam, but basically for now, just think of it as sort of the eastern part of the Islamic empires and then the western part of the Islamic empires. And we're going to look at major sort of medical authors, physicians, and natural philosophers, and alchemists as well, who are in the Eastern Caliphate, and then also look at the Western Caliphate, and in particular the Iberian Peninsula, sort of what's today Spain and Portugal, and some of the advances that were made there as well, some major works of sort of botany and pharmacology, as well as sort of medicine itself and natural philosophy. And then the IDs are the Abbasid Caliphate, which is one of the sort of Islamic empires, the House of Wisdom, where a lot of major translations took place, especially in the 8th and the 9th centuries, which is kind of the golden age of the Islamic learning. And then look at, again, a series of physicians, natural philosophers, or they actually called them physician philosophers. Ibn Sina, who is known in also in the Latinized version of his name, which is Avicenna. Al-Razi, whose Latinized name is Rhazes, and then Jabir or Gaber is the Latinized version. Again, we'll talk about all of them in more detail, and you'll see the sort of the Latinized names as well as the Arabic names. But I'm going to use the Arabic names because that's what they were called in Arabic, and I think that's sort of more accurate and kind of true to these people's names. And then the final idea is Al-Andalus, which is what the Iberian Peninsula was called when it was under Islamic control. And today, southern Spain is actually known as the region of southern Spain is called Andalusia, which comes directly from its name under Islamic rule. So I'm going to again start with sort of the broad historical context and talk a lot about geography and empires rising and falling and religions rising and spreading. As you'll see, Christianity and Islam are going to play a role in this lecture as well. Then we'll turn to the actual kind of science and medicine. So to begin, I just want to talk as briefly as I can about the rise of Christianity because there's a lot of material to cover. And if you've taken world history, or early Western Civ, or say a religion class in the rise of Christianity, this will be familiar. But just so that we're all on the same page, I want to sort of start here. Plus, Christianity is going to play a factor as we look at the Copernican revolution and other sort of various aspects of the scientific revolution that we're going to be looking at later in the early modern period. So I'm going to talk about that first. And actually, one other thing that I want to talk about before I go into the rise of Christianity is the sort of the chronology of what we're covering here. And actually, for that, let me go back to the outline for a minute. So where we left off with our last lecture and sort of the where we talked about the Hellenistic age and then sort of the Roman Empire, and we left off around 300 CE. That's basically where we're going to pick up today, then, is in the 300s of the Common Era, and then look at what happens to Rome through the 300s and 400s, and then with you see the fall of the Roman Empire that's generally accepted to be around 500 CE. Then the rise of Islam begins in the 600s, and then it really reaches its golden age, as I said a few minutes ago, in sort of the 700s, 800s, and we're going to then follow that through to into the thousands, or into what we call the 11th century. So this lecture really covers sort of 300 CE to about 1000 CE. Now, these are kind of rough dates, but that's sort of how to think about it. And this is known as sort of what they call late antiquity, sort of the later era of the ancient period, sort of the 300s, 400s, moving into the medieval period, which is usually marked by the fall of Rome, about 500 CE. So we're looking at late antiquity and then moving into the Middle Ages, or what's also known as the medieval period. So we're going to look at the medieval period in the Islamic world this week, and then next week we're going to look at the Middle Ages, or the medieval period, in the Latin, what they call the Latin West, which was basically the western part of the Roman Empire, the Latin-speaking part of the Roman Empire, that really sort of crumbles and fragments with the fall of Rome. So again, the Islamic piece of it in the Middle Ages this week, and then next week looking at the Latin West, or medieval Europe, and looking at the influence of Islamic science and medicine on medieval Europe. So with that, then, let me turn back to Christianity. So with the rise of Christianity. So Christianity sort of originates with Jesus of Nazareth, who comes from this area. You can see in this map of the Eastern Mediterranean, what's known as Palestine, where Israel and Palestine are located in the present day. And let me just grab my pen here. So this rectangle up here shows sort of the larger view of, what this sort of more narrow focus is of. This is where Jesus comes from. This is the area of his birthplace. And then you can see where it is in the Eastern Mediterranean, and how it's quite close to Anatolia, to Turkey, where a lot of the natural philosophers and physicians came from. It's close to Greece, where we're talking about, and then you can see where Rome is here, and then also Alexandria. So the main point here is just to show again that we're talking about this Eastern Mediterranean world right now, and there's so much trade and exchange of goods and ideas going on throughout this region of the world, which is really sort of a crossroads between East and West, and you could say between the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean, which sort of connects again sort of the western edges of Afro-Eurasia with East Asia, with the eastern edges of it as well. So a really important area of crossroads that's important for the rise of Islam as well. So Christianity arises with the teachings of Jesus, although he himself was Jewish and did not mean to create a new religion. He was a reformer, and his disciples, or his sort of students and the people that went out and then spread his message throughout the Mediterranean world, actually then added some ideas to his teachings that led to a break with Judaism and then the founding of this new religion of Christianity. So Christianity begins to spread throughout the Roman Empire and quickly meets with problems of persecution. Roman leaders who are pagans and are worshiping polytheistic gods that they largely adopted from the Greek tradition, they are very threatened by the Christians. They think that when Jesus talks about a kingdom of God, that he means an actual kingdom on earth, that this is a very subversive message. And so they set about persecuting Christians and bringing them into the Colosseum, as you can see here in Rome, and then, having lions attack them, or nailing them to crosses and then leaving them to die, and some really horrific, brutal practices. But instead of actually kind of snuffing out Christianity, the opposite happens, and many people are really impressed and moved by watching these Christians, going to their death willingly in the name of what they said was the one true God and the worship of the one true God, and their refusal to follow along with Roman polytheism. And what happens is Christianity actually grows more and more popular and begins to spread even further throughout the Roman Empire, to the point where the Emperor Constantine, who rules Rome in the early 300s, actually converts to Christianity in 313, and there's a lot of controversy as to why he decides to convert, but there's this sort of legend that he's going into battle and he has a dream the night before, and he decides that based on the contents of the dream, that if he wins the battle, he's going to convert to Christianity. So he wins the battle, so he converts. So he converts in 313, which obviously gives the Christians, a lot even more influence, and leads even more momentum to the spread of Christianity, to the point then where Christianity actually becomes the official state religion of Rome in 380 BC. And then the Roman leaders go and start to persecute people who aren't Christians. So you can see that sort of this complete reversal in some ways. But the main message for us is that Christianity is now the official religion of Rome and has spread throughout much of the Mediterranean. So here's a map. You can see the green areas denote sort of pockets of Christianity to around 200 CE, and then by 400 CE, the yellow regions indicate sort of the spread of Christianity. So you can see it's really starting to almost surround the Mediterranean and become much more widespread, and is in Egypt, and then again, around the area of Palestine where Jesus was from, in Turkey or Anatolia, and then throughout the Greek world. And then here's another map showing the spread of Christianity by 600 CE, and you can see that it has completely now surrounded the Mediterranean region, spread into this region, which is sort of known as Persia. Let me make that bigger to include that area as well. This is an area of sort of Persia, Mesopotamia, that had been part of the Eastern Hellenistic empires, that all now has become Christian. So that's what's sort of going on with Christianity. Now let's turn to what's going on with the Roman Empire generally. Basically, Rome really reaches the height of its power and influence in a period that's called the Pax Romana, or the Roman Peace, and a period known as sort of the Golden Age of Rome, when had reached its greatest extent surrounding the Mediterranean, had made great advances in architecture and engineering feats. And that was sort of in the 100s and the 200s, so the second and third centuries. But by the time you're getting into the fourth century and the fifth century, so into the 300s and 400s, which are what sort of concern us today, they're starting to experience a lot of problems. And I'm not going to go into any kind of detail about this, but there's a sense that there's sort of overpopulation and a lack of control. There's a lot of corruption among the elites. There's problems with the distribution of wealth, where the elites really control the vast majority of resources in the Roman Empire. And it's becoming more and more difficult to govern, with the idea that it's now grown so widespread that, the emperors really are sort of unable to control and properly govern the empire. So what Constantine actually decides to do is to split the Roman Empire into two halves. There's going to be an eastern half, and then there's going to be a western half. And along those lines, he actually establishes another sort of capital or sort of administrative center of the Roman Empire in a city that he names after himself, called Constantinople. And so basically, he has Rome now has two administrative centers that then are governed by kind of um, two main emperors, two main people who are in power, who are going to govern each of those halves. So here's a map. Don't worry about all this, where the home of these different emperors and things like that. Don't worry about that. What I really want you to get out of this map is the red, or the reddish orange area versus the green area. So the reddish orange area on the left is the western half of the Roman Empire. It's still under the control of Rome. And this is also known as sort of the Latin, the it's the I should say it's the Latin speaking part of the Roman Empire, and that later becomes labeled as the Latin West. So you've got the western half, which continues to be known as Rome and is governed by, with Rome as the capital, and then you've got the eastern half then, which is controlled, I should say, which is the Greek speaking part of the former Roman Empire. And its capital is in the city of Constantinople, which I will show you. It's actually not labeled in this map. So let me show you. So it's, again, ruled by two different capitals, Rome and then Constantinople, which is right here, which is a very strategic location. If you look, it's between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and was, again, an area of major crossroads of trade and exchange. So a very strategic location, and actually a really smart place to put the new capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. So let me go on. So what happens then following this is it does help splitting up the empire does help to mitigate some problems, but by the late 400s, the western part of the Roman Empire is really in decline and is facing a lot of threats from Germanic peoples around its borders, who are starting to invade and encroach on Roman lands. And this becomes so pronounced that Rome basically falls. The city is sacked around 500 CE and sort of destroyed, or a lot of it is destroyed, and the various Germanic groups are able to invade and then take over large parts of the western part of the Roman Empire, and it effectively falls. So this is what we think about when we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire. We really mean the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire. The eastern half actually stays intact. It has some major problems, and there are invasions, and we'll see it does lose territory, but it manages to stay in place and to continue on for many more centuries under the name of the Byzantine Empire, or Byzantium. So you have the fall of Rome, but then the fall of the western half of the empire, but the continuation of the eastern half of the empire. So you can see that in this map. This whole area had been under the control of basically the western half of the Roman Empire, and it falls to various Germanic invaders. You've got the Angles and the Saxons in what's today sort of in England, the Franks that invade much of France, where it gets its name from, Visigoths who go into southern France and then into this is the Iberian Peninsula here, where Spain and Portugal are today, Burgundians in parts of France, Lombards and Ostrogoths invade in Italy. So you can really see this invasion. And then, as you can see, it's sort of what had been under one administrative territory actually fragments into all sorts of different territories that become then the countries that become roughly the countries that we know today: Spain, France, England, Italy, Germany. I'm vastly simplifying here, but the main point here is that this large empire in the western half is now fragmented into a series of different states now controlled by, like I said, Germanic invaders. Whereas the eastern half, the Byzantine Empire, this whole purple area, stays largely intact for the moment. So this is basically the state of things around 500 AD. So again, you've got then the continuation of Byzantium. And so let me show you here again is another map showing you the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century. And then again, it's sort of its neighbors. So the sort of lighter green and the darker green are the Byzantine Empire. You can see that they do manage to take over parts of Italy for a while, but then they lose it to the Ostrogoths. Again, don't worry too much about that. The main point is that this is sort of the extent of the Byzantine Empire and that it stays largely intact, but constantly under the threat of the Germanic invaders and also under the threat of its neighbor to the east, what's known as the Sassanid Empire, which you can see down here in the key here. So the Sassanid Empire, not to make things too complicated, but the Sassanid Empire was basically an empire that governed an area known as Persia. It includes modern day sort of Iran, Iraq, or what we also refer to as Mesopotamia, and then further east into Central Asia as well. And this was sort of a takeover from that Eastern Hellenistic empire. If you think back to the time of Alexander the Great, and then when he died and his lands get divided up, this is the eastern part that Rome was actually never able to conquer. And so it had been taken over by other peoples and was not part of the Roman Empire. Similarly, then it's not part of Byzantium. And all of this you'll see why we're going into all of this in a little while. It's sort of important to understand the geography and the movement of these different empires and then the peoples within the empires. Okay, so moving on then. Byzantium also had problems with its Roman neighbors in terms of arguments over Christian doctrine. So we had seen that map of the spread of Christianity around 600 CE, and it all looked like this very nice, happy, solid mass of pink right around the Mediterranean, but all was not well in the early Christian church. In the sort of the 400s and 500s, the 5th and 6th centuries, there's a lot of arguments and debates over some key tenets of Christian doctrine that the leaders of the Christian church cannot agree on. And so you actually see a split between an Eastern and a Western Christian church that mirrors in some ways the split of the Roman Empire. You've got what's known as the Roman Church, sort of in the Western half of the split. So the Western Roman Church, and then you've got the Eastern Roman Church, which was the Byzantine Empire, or the Byzantine Church. And today, the Western Roman Church, or I should say, the Western Roman Church then soon after becomes known as the Roman Catholic Church. And then the Eastern Church becomes known as the Greek Orthodox Church. And that split continues to this day. You've got, the Greek Orthodox Christianity has some very different ideas and practices than the Roman Catholic Church, but still under that large umbrella of Christianity. These are still both Christian religions. Okay, so why is this all relevant then? This is an important basis for knowing what comes later in the class, but also for what comes now in the lecture. One of the problems and the arguments in the Christian church was over the nature of Jesus and whether he was human or divine or both. And there were some leaders in the Christian church, like Nestorius, who was an Archbishop of Constantinople. So he was part of the Byzantine Church and part of the Byzantine Empire. And he argued that Jesus was both human and divine, but that he tended to emphasize Jesus's human characteristics and said that they were basically split in a sense. Whereas the Roman Catholic Church argued that he was, they eventually come to the argument that Jesus is Father, I start to say that God is a Father, Jesus is the Son, and there's a Holy Ghost. This is the Trinity, and they are all one. So they're sort of three and one at the same time, where the Nestorians said, no, there's a division, and they tended to emphasize Jesus's human attributes. So this was not okay with the Byzantine Eastern Orthodox Church either. And so they expel the Nestorians. So this Nestorius gets a bunch of followers, and they're called Nestorian Christians, and they're expelled from Byzantium. And so they go to the Sassanid Empire, where they actually are welcomed. I won't go into this in any detail, but the main religion of the Sassanid Empire was a religion called Zoroastrianism, which had a lot in common with Christianity, and they were quite open to the Nestorians. So the Nestorians go into sort of this area of Persia, and they actually establish missions throughout Persia, and they actually, this is a good subject for a world history class, but they actually go all the way to China, and they have Christian missions throughout East Asia and spread Christianity into China. And there are Chinese texts, Chinese scrolls about Christian doctrine. But for our purposes, the main point here is that the Nestorians go to Persia, and they find sort of a welcome there. And when they do that, they bring a lot of the Greek learning from Byzantium with them, and they translate it into sort of the main language of the Sassanid Empire, which was Syriac. It's a sort of an ancient language derived from another ancient language, Aramaic, or related to it. It's a Semitic language. Don't worry about it too much. But just the main point here is that you've got some Christians expelled from Byzantium. They go further east into Persia. They bring these Greek texts with them, and they start to translate them into kind of the local language. And they provide an important link, as we'll later see, between then the Greek-speaking world and then the Arabic-speaking world that then arises with the Islamic empires. And this is all sort of happening in Persia. And so let me show you then a couple of maps of then the Sassanid Empire, or this area called Persia right here. And I just want to say, you can see it's right next to the Arabian Peninsula, which is the birthplace of Islam. And again, and look how close it is also to the birthplace of Christianity. So these, again, I can't emphasize enough what an important crossroads this area is in world history and in the history of science. So again, and then here's just another sort of map of the Nestorians in Persia, and they mainly settled in an area that I'll show you, or I should say, in a city that I'll show you in the next map of Gondishapur or Jundishapur. I see it spelled all sorts of different ways, but they established a sort of a big intellectual center there, and a medical school that may actually have existed or may be kind of mythical. But the important point is that they establish an important area. I'm sorry, an important sort of intellectual center. And so here is, you can see Jundishapur or Gondishapur here in the Sassanid Empire. And so that's sort of, they go to various places, but that's sort of main center for the Nestorian Christians bringing the Greek texts. And so here again is a sort of a topographical map showing the modern day outlines of where Iraq and Iran are located, and then here's Baghdad, which actually doesn't exist yet in the history that we are covering. It's not established until the 700s, but just to give you a sense of this is where we're talking about. This is sort of the areas of the world, and then here's the Persian Gulf right here. So. And then here are some ruins of an academy that was established in Gondishapur. Whether or not these are the actual ruins of the former medical school and whether this medical school actually existed, we don't exactly know. The main point again being that there's that there was that Gondishapur is an important intellectual center where a lot of intellectual life was taking place, and in particular the transmission of Greek works and their translation to the local language. So that brings me now then to the rise and spread of Islam. So at this stage, we're sort of into the 500s. The Roman Empire has fallen. The Byzantine Empire is still intact, but under threat, under siege. You do in the Byzantine Empire still have the continuation of the Greek language. So this is the Greek speaking part of the Roman Empire. And the preservation of, a lot of the Greek natural philosophical texts from the classical era and the works of Galen. But with the control of the Christian church in this case, there's much more emphasis on theological writings rather than the pursuit of natural philosophy. So you do see a few scholars who pursue Platonic ideas, which were more in line in many ways, at least at this stage, with Christianity, where a demiurge is easily sort of conceived of as, say, the Christian God who sort of controls everything and directs everything. It was more easily adapted to Christianity. So you have some Platonic authors who were now called Neoplatonic, or sort of that means like New Platonic authors in the Byzantine Empire. But for the most part, you don't see sort of a lot of progress or advance of natural philosophy under the Byzantine Empire. I'm really sort of generalizing here, but just to sort of say there is sort of a preservation and some continuation, but a lot of the learning and intellectual life is taken over by Christian theology. Where we do see intellectual progress and advance taking place, though, is with the rise of Islam and especially the establishment of Islamic empires in the medieval period. So again, that takes us up through sort of the 5th century, the 6th century. Now we turn to the 7th century, the 600s, which is when you see the rise of the religion of Islam, which is to a certain extent built upon Christian concepts, which is in turn was built upon then the Jewish concepts that Jesus was teaching and then trying to reform. And that's largely because of where Islam originated. So it originated in an area of the world called the Arabian Peninsula. So I'll show that to you here in this sort of map of Afro-Eurasia. It's right here. Here's the Arabian Peninsula, and I wanted to show it to you in this particular map because, again, you can see how it is right in the middle of a number of major trade routes. You've got trade routes called the Silk Roads, which basically connected China with Europe along the sort of red lines here are the overland routes that connected China with Europe and also China with India. And then the blue lines here are then the sea routes that also connected all of these parts of the world. And you can see how the Arabian Peninsula, again, is sort of right in the middle of all of these areas. And so it was an interesting kind of bifurcated society in the sense that much of the Arabian Peninsula is covered in desert and was inhabited by um, nomadic sort of desert peoples who were had very strong kind of tribal local identities. They were called Bedouins. I don't think I have it written in a slide, so I'll spell it for you. Bedouins is Bedouins. So Bedouins. So it was largely inhabited by Bedouin peoples who lived in the Arabian Peninsula and also across North Africa. But it had also a large settled population that lived in cities. So you have these nomadic sort of desert tribal peoples, and then you have a number of key um, urban areas that were where a lot of merchants lived, and there was a lot of trade going on. Again, because of its location within the Silk land routes and sea routes of the Silk Roads. So let me show you here. So there's a lot of really important sort of trade routes within the Arabian Peninsula, and a lot of you can see a number of different cities. Let me show you another slide here of the different cities and trade routes, sea routes of the Arabian Peninsula, and then the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea that sort of surround it. So you have this sort of cosmopolitan urban population with this sort of desert population. Um, and the urban population in particular was had a lot of contact with and influence from merchants and traders who were then coming, from the areas of the Christianized lands and areas where Jewish people lived as well. And so they actually had a lot of contact with Christians and Jews, and a lot of the Christian and Jewish ideas were circulating through the Arabian Peninsula. And you can see that in its influence on Islamic ideas and on the founder of Islam, who is known as the Prophet Muhammad. So let me turn to Muhammad now, but actually first I just want to show you this one final slide of all these different kind of trade routes through the Arabian Peninsula. So I think you get the idea. So you can imagine then, again, Christian and Jewish influence crisscrossing this area. So who is the Prophet Muhammad? Muhammad was actually a merchant who lived in the city of Mecca. He was actually an orphan who was able to rise up and actually become a relatively wealthy merchant in the city of Mecca. He's known in Islam as the fourth and final prophet, which I'll explain in just a minute. Muhammad then was from the city of Mecca, right here in this sort of key location of the Arabian Peninsula, and again, sort of a relatively successful merchant, although he was illiterate. So Muhammad was an orphan and had, as I said, become a relatively successful merchant, but was otherwise unremarkable. He was born in 570, died in 632. So again, we're at the late sort of 500s, early 600s. And as I said, had sort of lived a relatively unremarkable life, although by all accounts a very kind, generous man who, because he was an orphan, always wanted to sort of practice charitable giving, but otherwise unremarkable until he began to have dreams. And in these dreams, he said that the angel Gabriel came to him in his dreams and began to speak to him and to relay a message that the angel Gabriel said came directly from God, or Allah in Arabic, and that God said through the angel Gabriel directly to Muhammad, said that Muhammad was his fourth and final prophet. Hold on, let me go back. Right here, that Muhammad was God's fourth and final prophet. The first three prophets being Abraham of the ancient Israelites, the sort of the founding kind of patriarch of the ancient Israelites, um, and kind of the founder of Judaism. Then Moses, to whom God appeared and presented the Ten Commandments, and then Jesus, all of whom were considered prophets. They're considered prophets in Islam because God spoke directly to them according to Jewish and Christian teachings, and according to Islamic teachings as well. But that Muhammad was now the fourth and the final prophet to whom God was going to reveal his true and full word. And so Muhammad starts telling people this, and at first they think he's crazy, but he speaks in such a beautiful and poetic way that people start to write down, that he begins to convince more and more and more followers. And to make what is a long story very, very short, he begins to gain followers and eventually is able to take over Mecca and most of the other cities of the Arabian Peninsula, and gain enough followers to establish Islam throughout the Arabian Peninsula. By his death in 632 CE, he had established Islam as I said, as the main religion in the Arabian Peninsula. So this is then a writing of Muhammad's first revelation, what the angel Gabriel told to him in his dream, that again, people later wrote down, and this becomes the Quran. And the Quran is considered the word of God, the word of Allah directly. And so it actually is if you want to read the Quran and its true message, you need to read it in Arabic. And there's sort of no debate about what those words are and what they mean, because again, they're considered the word of God, which is different from the Bible, which is understood to be people writing down the stories of Jesus. I'm talking about the New Testament, and there's a lot of debate about the words. The Bible is translated into many languages. I mean, the Quran is too, but again, if you want to read the true word of God, you have to read it in Arabic. That's not so for the Bible, and then the meanings of biblical passages are debated and have been for millennia. So that's a sort of a major difference between the Quran and then say the New Testament. At any rate, that establishes Islam, and as I said, it begins to spread. So this is a map then of this whole region that we're talking about, kind of what's known as kind of the Indo-Mediterranean, which stretches from Spain in the west to the Indus Valley to basically India in the east, Central Asia. And so in 624 AD, it's basically, this is where Islam is just in its beginning phase. But as you can see, again, here's the Sassanid Empire, the orangey brown area. Then the purple is the Byzantine Empire, and then you've got again the sort of the Germanic areas, the Visigoths and the Franks in kind of France and Spain. You'll see how much this map changes in just within a century. Islam basically spreads throughout the Arabian Peninsula and then out of the Arabian Peninsula and takes over a large portion of these areas, as you'll see in just a minute. So I wanted to show you this map right here. So this is our baseline right at the start of the spread of Islam or the establishment of Islam. So by Muhammad's death in 632, you can see Islam here is that dark part, dark blue of the Arabian Peninsula. And then once Muhammad dies, the followers that kind of take over from him, they call themselves his deputies or his caliphs. And so a family who had been very close followers of Muhammad, uh, again, I'm vastly simplifying things, but once Muhammad dies, there's a family called the Umayyad family that rises up and declares themselves to be the leaders of Islam, and the patriarch of the family is considered the caliph, is considered Muhammad's deputy to continue spreading the message of Islam that Muhammad had begun, and to spread Islam. That was their intent. And so the Umayyads then, and I'll show you the spelling of that in just a second. I'd say don't worry about that right now. I just want to give you kind of an overview. So this family of Umayyads that takes over after Muhammad's death is within a century. So roughly think of it from 650 to 750 CE. They're able to spread Islam through this whole area that I'm circling right here. Everything that's blue and green and sort of gray comes under Islamic control because they're able to take over Persia or the Sassanid Empire, and then they're able to take over large swaths of what had been under Byzantine control, particularly this area of North Africa, which includes Egypt and then that really important center of Alexandria. So let me go through this then a little bit more slowly. So after Muhammad dies, then the spread of Islam, or the control over Islam or leadership of Islam, is taken over by the Umayyad Caliphate, or the caliph, the Umayyad caliph, who then continues to spread the religion out and far beyond the Arabian Peninsula. And they establish what's known as the Umayyad Caliphate. And so that's where you can see how it's spelled. And so here's another map. So again, you can see the spread of Islam to the death of Muhammad in that dark purple. Then the slightly lighter purple is where it's spread to 661. And then by 733, it's spread again through this whole, all of the purple here is under Umayyad control. So it's just an absolutely meteoric rise. Within 100 years, they're able to really spread Islamic control again from India to Spain. It's a meteoric rise to power. Again, I would say don't worry so much about 632, 661, 733. Think of it more as from 650 to 750. You've got a vast spread of Islam. And then here's just another map then of the Umayyad Caliphate, just so you can sort of, again, get another visual of just how widespread it was. And one thing I just want to point out here is that you can see that it also spreads into Europe, into the Iberian Peninsula here, and they do this in 711. That's an easy date to remember, 711. They actually are able to cross what are known as the Straits of Gibraltar from North Africa into Spain, and then within about 2 decades, within the space of 20 years, are able to take over almost the entire Iberian Peninsula. There's still this one little line of northern Spain that they were unable to conquer, that stays Christian, but beyond that, it becomes under Islamic control. Okay, so let me move on then. The Umayyads establish their capital in the city of Damascus and begin to support intellectual endeavors there, and make Damascus into a beautiful sort of capital city. They establish a beautiful mosque there. There's a gate to the city, sort of famous gate to the city. And then here's another map of the mosque in Damascus that was constructed in the 8th century. So they make it into a sort of a beautiful, glittering capital that, again, supports sort of intellectual life and learning. But the real, as we'll see in a minute, the real kind of contribution of the Islamic empires to learning comes with the successors to the Umayyad state, who then move their capital to Baghdad. So now I'll turn to that. So around 750 AD, the Umayyads actually fall from power for a bunch of reasons that I won't go into. And then the area that they had controlled then is overtaken by another family called the Abbasids. And they established then the Abbasid Caliphate, basically in the same place where the Umayyad Caliphate had been established. They sort of take over the same territory. With the exception of Spain, the Umayyads actually are able to stay in control in Spain, but it's still an area that is governed by Islamic leaders, and they are connected in with the Abbasid leaders. There is some connection between them and some communication. So to all intents and purposes, the Abbasids take over the former Umayyad territory, and they really go about trying to consolidate rather than continuing to expand like the Umayyads did and spread themselves really thin. The Abbasids decide to sort of hunker down and really try to solidify and strengthen their rule in this vast territory. And as part of that, they actually moved the capital then to Baghdad. They established the city of Baghdad in 762 and make that the capital. That's sort of smack dab in the middle of this area of Persia, what had been the Sassanid Empire. And in this way, they could really take advantage of the centralized administrative framework of the Sassanid Empire, and like I said, sort of strengthen and solidify their rule. So they establish, as I said, Baghdad as the capital, and that was done by the first Abbasid caliph, known as Al-Mansur. So Al-Mansur ruled between 754 and 775 AD. He was, as I said, the leader to establish Baghdad as the capital, and started a tradition that then was followed by later caliphs of supporting, again, intellectual life, schools, and education. And that really starts to come to fruition in the next century, in the sort of the early to mid 800s. And this is considered then the beginning of the golden age of kind of Islamic learning, particularly, as we'll see, in the areas of medicine and natural philosophy. So now you can see where this is all coming together and why we've learned all of this sort of political and geographic sort of historical background to this. So Al-Mansur then establishes Baghdad as the capital. He builds a beautiful palace in Baghdad, the Abbasid Palace. And here's a drawing of the Abbasid court. So he moves the court there as well with all of his advisors. And now we'll turn then to the science and medicine that he and his successors then really supported as they sought to solidify and expand and extend their power. So let's turn then to the great progress and advancements that took place in science and medicine in the Islamic world that largely originates in Baghdad with the establishment of a remarkable institution of learning that sort of served as a library and a medical school and a translation center. It may be mythical, but at the same time, there was a real concentration of an intellectual center there in Baghdad, just like Gandhishapur. Even if some of these ideas might be a bit mythical, there was a center for translation and medical education that involved a large degree of natural philosophy as well as alchemy, as we'll see in just a minute. So that institution in Baghdad was the House of Wisdom. And I'm going to talk about what the House of Wisdom was, who established it, and then what happened there. It was largely a translation center, and then what the different kinds of translations were, and some of the major translators and how they went about working. So in Baghdad, under the rule of a later Abbasid ruler, al-Rashid, he put a huge amount of money and support into gathering up ancient learned texts and then translating them into Arabic. And this involved Persian texts as well as the Greek texts of the natural philosophers. And usually what people mainly talk about is the translation of the Greek works, which is what we're going to focus on as well, since that's in line with how this class is advancing. But I do want to point out that there are a number of really important Persian medical and scientific works that were translated as well. Just to sort of put that out there, even though now we are gonna sort of concentrate mainly on the Greek works. But al-Rashid supported the establishment of a translation center that is referred to as the House of Wisdom. Again, it I've read different things. I've read that the House of Wisdom actually existed. I've read things that it's sort of this mythical thing that there was no real sort of House of Wisdom. But regardless, there were institutions in which translations were taking place of these Greek and Persian works. And al-Rashid, and then we'll see another, his successor, the caliph who succeeded him, put a lot of support into this, put a lot of funding into it. They sponsored scholars who would travel through Persia and to the Byzantine Empire to collect these medical works and bring them back and translate them. They sent people to Alexandria specifically to collect the medical works of the medical school there. Galen's works had been translated and kind of abridged and were being taught at the medical school in Alexandria. So they collected basically the whole medical curriculum from Alexandria was brought to Baghdad. And if you'll remember, there were a number of Nestorian Christians then in Gandhishapur, and they also sponsored those scholars then to come to Baghdad to continue the translation enterprise that had been happening there. And I'll talk about that more in just a minute. But so al-Rashid sponsored this translation movement, and so did his successor al-Mamun. And if you look, they ruled in the sort of late 700s to the early 800s. And this is sort of considered the golden age of Islamic learning and intellectual development. So think of this as sort of 750 to 850 as sort of the golden age of learning. Now it continues, the great sort of learning and advancements continue after that, but this is the golden age of the kind of the translation enterprise. So think of 650 to 750 as the time that Islam is being established and spread throughout that sort of vast territory. And then 750 to 850 is the time when then they're sort of focusing in on the intellectual developments in the newly founded city of Baghdad. And the picture of al-Mamun to the right, the image to the right, actually depicts him meeting people from the Byzantine court. So there was interaction between the Islamic leaders, and then the Greek Christian leaders of Byzantium, and again, sort of a flow of this intellectual material from Byzantium into the Islamic world. So let's just talk about the House of Wisdom for a few minutes. There's these wonderful depictions, kind of like the Museum of Alexandria, of what this House of Wisdom may have looked like. It was, I think, fundamentally a library where scholars and largely medical scholars would go to learn and to consult with one another, and also where these texts of the Greek natural philosophers and physicians were brought in then to be translated to Arabic. So I'm just going to show a few images of the House of Wisdom here. Here's another drawing of it. Um, Again, it may be a bit of a myth, kind of an overblown, sort of romanticized vision of this wonderful school, like that painting of the School of Athens. But regardless, we know that there was a lot of translating going on um, in Baghdad at this time. So here's another image of it. Here's another sort of image of scholars reading and learning from each other in the House of Wisdom. And then here's astronomers in the House of Wisdom as well. And we will talk about Islamic astronomers, but I'm going to save that for when we talk about the Copernican revolution and then continue reading on in the Kuhn book, because he will talk about the Islamic astronomers. So what I'm going to focus more on today is medicine and alchemy within the Islamic empires, and then talk about some specific authors and some specific people who were working on that. But first, again, I want to talk a little bit more about the translations. So a really important early figure in the House of Wisdom was a man by the name of Yuhana ibn Mazawai, or just also referred to in a sort of a Latinized version as Mezue. And he lived in sort of the later 8th, early 9th century and was a physician from Gondishapur, and he was a Nestorian Christian. So now you see where the Nestorian Christians sort of fit into this story. And a lot of the early translators in Baghdad and the medical scholars were Nestorian Christians. And so you see that link from Gondishapur and from the sort of Nestorian line. And he was he wrote a number of medical treatises. He taught other physicians. He was the physician to the caliph, sort of the royal physician, and he also did some translating himself. But he had a student, a very, very famous student. And I should say these two figures are very famous in Islamic history as well, and in the history of science. But he had a student, also a Nestorian Christian, named Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who lived in sort of the early to mid 9th century. And Ishaq is credited with being probably the most prolific and the most influential of all of the translators coming out of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. He translated dozens of Galenic texts. He translated Aristotle's work. He translated Dioscorides, who we learned about with the Roman period, who wrote De Materia Medica about medicinal substances. He also translated some Platonic works, and so this was the basis of what people were collecting at the House of Wisdom. They wanted the works of Aristotle, of Plato, of Galen, of Hippocrates as well, of Dioscorides, and really of any of the natural philosophers that we've been talking about so far. But those were the main texts that they wanted to collect. And in the end, they were successful at translating all of Galen's works. I think it was 129 works of Galen were translated. And as I said in the last lecture, his works constituted 10% of the written work available from the ancient period. And so he wrote a lot. And as you read from last week, he was also very wordy. And so they were able to translate the entire Galenic corpus, like I said, as well as the works, any works they could get their hands on of Aristotle, Plato, Hippocrates, Dioscorides, and others. But those are kind of the main players that we know of now. And again, and then the abridged versions of it that were being used in the Alexandrian medical schools, they brought to Baghdad and they wanted to translate that. But I want to say though that the translations were not actually. Let me go back to this. Sorry, this slide where I talk about the different kind of translations that took place. So we've looked at kind of the translation support from the caliphs, but the translate and we've talked about the major translators. So let me talk about the translation process, the Syriac and the Arabic translations. So you might think translation is a pretty straightforward process. You read it and then you just convert it into those words into your language. But in this case of the Arabic translations, it was actually a really complex process for a couple of reasons. First of all, you had to know a lot of languages. You had to know Arabic, you had to know Greek, you had to know Syriac, and you also really had to know Persian because they were translating Persian works as well. And it might help to know Latin as well if you're finding some of the Latin translations of the original Greek works, say from Byzantium. So you need to know all of these different languages. And you needed to know Syriac because a lot of these works had already been translated from Greek to Syriac, as we talked about with the Nestorian Christians in Gondishapur, who had already brought a lot of the Greek texts with them and translated them to Syriac. So in Baghdad, a lot of what was happening then was translating the Syriac to Arabic. But then when you brought in new Greek texts, then you would go directly from the Greek to the Arabic, although sometimes they would still do that middle stage of going from Greek to Syriac to Arabic. So you can start to get a sense of just how complicated this is. To make things even more complicated, they often didn't have the vocabulary to translate the Greek words. There were so many sort of new concepts and new ideas coming out of Greek philosophy that were not part of Arabic or Islamic culture or language, that there literally weren't words to translate them to. There weren't even the concepts behind the words. So these translators actually had to learn, they weren't just translating, they were learning the natural philosophy and the medicine as they were reading these texts and translating them. And then they had to formulate and make up a new medical and scientific vocabulary to be able to translate these words into Arabic. And this was made possible and also necessary because Ibn Ishaq's main sort of method for translating was a new way. Previous translations were usually done literally word for word. You would just take one word and then translate that from, say, the Greek or the Syriac to the Arabic. But once Ibn Ishaq comes into the picture in the House of Wisdom, and he actually becomes kind of the head of the House of Wisdom and the head translator, he says, we're not going to do it that way. That's not going to make any sense because we don't have the vocabulary to be able to match it word for word, and it will just be gibberish. It won't make any sense. Or sometimes they would just transliterate the Greek words, the letters of the Greek words into Arabic letters and just have this, undecipherable word. So what Ibn Ishaq said they needed to do was not translate word for word, but rather translate concepts. So take a sentence and figure out what that sentence really means and then put it into an Arabic that will make sense and that will clearly convey the concept. So you've got to learn the concept, you've got to develop the vocabulary you need to express that concept, and then write it in your own words to be able to convey the true and clear meaning of that sentence. So again, you can get a sense of just what a huge undertaking this was, and how by the end of it, these translators become experts themselves. And they begin to write their own medical treatises as well. And Ibn Ishaq actually translates a bunch of Galen's work, but in doing so, again, renders it into his own language and his own understanding of Galen's work. And that became the basic text for medical schools in medieval Europe, which we'll start to see next week. Um, so Ibn Ishaq has a huge impact on European medical learning in the Latin West as it starts to kind of recover after the fall of the Roman Empire. Again, that's sort of foreshadowing to next week. But that should give you then a sense of this translation enterprise that was happening in the House of Wisdom, and that it was more than just sort of a simple set of translations. It involved multiple languages, it involved developing new vocabulary, and then studying and learning and internalizing, grasping those concepts yourself. So let's move on then. I'm going to go back through these slides that I already showed you to come to the next stage of the lecture, which is now I want to go into a treatment of the individual sort of authors, Islamic authors and scholars that we're going to be talking about then for the rest of the lecture, just to, by no means are we going to be covering all of them, but just sort of to highlight a few of them and then what their contributions are. Again, not to sort of get overwhelmed, but rather just to kind of highlight and give some examples. And when I do this, I'm actually going to divide the Islamic empires between what was called the Eastern Caliphate and the Western Caliphate. And you can kind of see that in this map here. Don't worry about all the different colors here and the different who's directing what area. The main thing here is to know that all of this is basically under the Abbasids, except, oh shoot, sorry, I have to get my pen again. Hold on, sorry. All of this is under the Abbasids, basically, except for Andalusia or Spain, Al-Andalus here. But if it's simpler, just think of it as all under Abbasid power, but kind of divided in terms of the center of gravity between this, let me actually bring it down here, sort of the Eastern Caliphate here, and then the Western Caliphate, which is basically Spain and North Africa, and then the Eastern Caliphate, which, you know, had sort of the majority of the territory here, and obviously is where Baghdad is located. This was sort of the western, I'm sorry, the eastern part of the empires, and it was separated from Spain, and it's a way, although there was communication between them, there is a sense that there was sort of this western outpost and then this eastern area. So that's how I'm going to cover it in this class too. So to begin with, in the Eastern Caliphate, we will start by talking about medicine and then the contributions of Ibn Sina, or Latinized to Avicenna. You may have heard of him in that way. And then look at alchemy, which we're reading about in The Secrets of Alchemy, which includes Al-Razi and then Jabir. And so... Oh, and I was going to say, so, and we've also had then a primary source reading from Ibn Sina's major work called the Canons of Medicine. So you've read about him, you've read his actual words in the canon, or will read them following the lecture. So Avicenna is probably, or I should say Ibn Sina is considered probably the greatest scholar of the Islamic Middle Ages, very, very well recognized at the time. And through to this day. He lived, as you can see, from 980 to 1037, which is a bit after the sort of that golden age of the translation movement in Baghdad. And he actually came from an area that was sort of outside kind of the center of intellectual developments as well, but despite that, he is, as I said, extremely well recognized, just a great scholar. So, a little bit about his biography. So, he came from a city called Bukhara, which is in modern day Uzbekistan in Central Asia. So, here is Bukhara. And you can see it's quite a ways here from Baghdad, but uh, Ibn Sina actually traveled all around, this sort of, he leaves Bukhara, he travels all around what is modern day Iran and Iraq. And it's said that he was recognized very early on as a child prodigy, just an absolute genius. It's said that he memorized the entire Quran by the time he was 10 years old. He also studied a number of different subjects, including, well, I should say, in addition to medicine. He's probably best known or very well known for his works in medicine, but he was also interested in cosmology, in subjects of philosophy, morality, ethics, and he wrote on these topics as well. And actually, it's said that he was more interested in these other topics and sort of kind of did medicine on the side. But in doing so, he produced probably one of the greatest and most well recognized medical texts of all time, which is called the Canons of Medicine. And here's some images of early Arabic manuscripts of the Canon of Medicine, and that the canon actually is just a monumental work. In a modern edition today, there's a recent translation, which you can see the book bindings of these of the 5 volumes that comprise this canon of medicine. So it's basically divided into 5 volumes or 5 books, and each of them is about 1,000 pages each. So this is just an absolutely monumental work. And I'm pleased to say that I own 3 of these 5 volumes actually for my own research. And this is the only modern English translation of the Canons of Medicine. There was an earlier translation of just of volume 1, but it's actually quite confusing and hard to know which are the actual words of Avicenna. I should say Ibn Sina, which are his actual words and which are the commentaries. And so I was actually really pleased to see a few years ago that there is now a modern English translation of it, but even so, it's still not a critical scholarly edition. And you can see then where there is, I think, a great need to have so many of these masterful works brought into sort of modern editions, translated into language. I should say modern Arabic there should be modern Arabic critical editions of these in addition to translations, so that scholars who don't know Arabic can have access to these primary sources as well. So I was very pleased to see this translation, but I think more of this kind of work really needs to be done. At any rate, this, as you can see, the Canon of Medicine is in these 5 volumes. The first volume deals with issues of natural philosophy, and we are actually reading excerpts from this. This is where that primary source reading comes from volume 1 on the natural philosophy. And I think you'll see some things that look very familiar there. But if you compare that reading from the Canons of Medicine for this week to the excerpt from Galen's writings that we read last week, I think you'll see that it's much more straightforward and succinct, easier to follow, less wordy. And that is part of what Avicenna's, oh, I keep saying that, part of what Ibn Sina's genius was to take Galen's often meandering and quite difficult writing style and be able to streamline it and make it clear. And in addition to that, he took there were various issues that Galen had basically left unresolved or that were contradictory, and he tries to solve these problems as well. So there's a lot of innovation in the Canon of Medicine as well. Just an incredibly important work, not only again for making making Galen's work and writings clear to a larger audience, clarifying his arguments, but also again solving any problems that he had left unresolved or that he actually sort of made because of contradictions in his own work that he hadn't worked out. and in general, putting this together in a systematic way, but also adding innovation to it. So really, really important work here. And you'll see, as I said, volume one deals with the natural philosophy. Then volume two deals with what were called the simples, or basically the medicinal ingredients that Dioscorides had talked about in De Materia Medica. What Ibn Sina does then is to record the different sort of herbs and mineral and animal materials that Dioscorides had talked about, but also incorporated new substances that subsequent authors had discovered and included into these lists as well. And he tried to go about systematically filling out any information that Dioscorides or subsequent authors had not included about these substances as well. And so he tried to sort of complete the picture of what people knew about these ingredients, and also systematize it and include the information about what were its qualities. Was it hot, cold, wet, or dry? What does it heal? And how should this substance be prepared? So that's what he talks about in volume two. Volumes three and four talk about various diseases and how to cure these diseases, using these kinds of medicinal ingredients. And then volume five talks about how you can put these processed ingredients, how you can combine them into compounded medicines, things like ointments and plasters and syrups, lozenges, things that are still very familiar with us today, that actually ancient Greeks had been compounding as well. Avicenna doesn't, Ibn Sina doesn't sort of invent all of these different compounded medicines, but there is an Islamic contribution to compounded medicines, because they start to use actually crystallized cane sugar to make things like syrups. So Arabic authors do add certain compounded medicines to the kind of the array of things that were being formulated during this time. So that is the canon of medicine, and Ibn Sina's contribution, his major contribution to medicine. Again, not only sort of bringing together and clarifying Galen's sort of medical corpus, but also providing innovation, bringing in new material and new explication as well. And you can see his importance in this sort of medieval woodcut that is showing sort of the three, what were considered sort of the three masters of medicine. And you see on the left there Hippocrates, then in the middle Galen, and then to the right there is Ibn Sina, or here he's referred to as Avicenna. So this is a later sort of Latin woodcut from the Middle Ages that again it gives you a sense of who is being recognized here as a master of medicine. And Ibn Sina's work, the Canon of Medicine, was read in medical schools in medieval Europe and well into the early modern period, as well as late as the 18th century. His works dominated medical education in Europe as well. So again, really, really important figure in the history of medicine, as I'm sure you now have the sense of. So let's turn then now to alchemy and the Arabic contributions to alchemy, and major figures in that, including Al-Razi and then Jabir. But before I go into their particular contributions, I want to go back into some of the history of the origins of alchemy in the Western tradition, and then bring back, sort of, I should say, go into some of the readings that we did last week in the Secrets of Alchemy, setting out the origins of alchemy in the Hellenistic period, and then again moving into this into the Arabic period. So to do that, then we need to go back to Alexandria, again, where you have the library, the medical schools. This is where Herophilus and Erasistratus were doing their dissections and making their medical theories. This is also then where a series of craft traditions are being practiced, and eventually some of these craft procedures get written down. And this happens during the Hellenistic period as well, among sort of artisan scholars who are located in and around the area of Alexandria, again in the Ptolemaic Empire, as part of the Hellenistic empires, the Hellenistic world, and that sort of Hellenistic period that goes roughly from about 300 BCE to about 300 CE. So this is where we're going back to, and then again we're going to go forward in time into the Arabic period. But first I want to set out this basis, and in particular, scholars argue that alchemy actually develops out of the craft traditions, and it is the craft traditions are seen as encapsulated and first written down in two really important early sets of works that are referred to as the Leiden Papyrus, and then, as we'll see, the Stockholm Papyrus, just because that's where these papyri ended up in libraries in Leiden and Stockholm, not because they're Swedish, or whatever recipes or Dutch recipes, but because that's where they're located today. But they were, recorded and written down in and around Alexandria sometime in the fourth or fifth century, the 300s, 400 CE. We don't know exactly when they were written down, but they can be dated to approximately that period, and they're referred to as papyri or the papyrus because they were written down on the Egyptian papyrus. So the Leiden and the Stockholm papyri include a whole bunch of recipes. And these recipes referred to various craft traditions, in particular the making of, in these recipes, the making of different kinds of dyes, especially, or I said inks and dyes, way to dye cloth, ways to dye stones, and then also ways to tinge metals. So to try to, change the color and the hue of a stone or a metal, and then also how to make perfumes. And this all then refers back to those earlier craft traditions that we had talked about, that I had talked about in previous lectures, from the Babylonian traditions, that then the Greek and the Egyptian traditions that then the Greeks later can adopt and adapt. They would also include glass making, brewing, and things along those lines. But what you see mainly in these papyri are recipes, as I said, for making inks, making dyes, and tinging metals, and also, I should say, also making, along those lines, making paints. A lot of this has to do with pigmentation and color changes. And so in this way, too, scholars have said that some of these recipes may refer to, people trying to counterfeit metals, trying to make, copper or tin, giving it a sort of golden sheen and a golden hue so that they can pass it off as gold, or by the same token, taking stones and then trying to dye them, or maybe taking crystals and trying to dye them, a deep red or a deep green, and then pass them off as rubies or emeralds. So there may be some counterfeit processes taking place as well. But the reason they are so important in the history of alchemy, because you might be saying, what does this have to do with, the early history of chemistry? The reason why they're very important is because they included the descriptions, they included these basically recipes that describe and outline a variety of chemical procedures and operations that then are later capitalized on by alchemists in order to try to actually truly turn what they thought they could truly turn, base metals or other kinds of metals into gold. So non-gold metals, say tin, I shouldn't say tin, copper, or iron, to transform them into, say, silver or gold. That they truly thought, alchemists later truly thought they could do that. But the procedures here for tinging metals were a really important part of learning for practitioners to learn how to manipulate natural materials and make changes in these materials. So let me show you here that, so this is an image of the actual papyri from the Leiden papyrus recipes, and then to the right here are some of the actual pages from the Stockholm papyrus recipes as well. or some, the middle one is actually an original, and then to the right would be sort of a later actual Latin. That's actually a later Latin translation of it from the Middle Ages. And then to the left, you can see on the left-hand side, you can see that these recipes have actually been transcribed and translated into English in a modern critical edition that's actually available online. You can type that into Google Books, and you can download the Leiden and Stockholm papyri and all of those recipes. And here's a recipe from the Stockholm papyrus for dyeing wool a very, very dark yellow. And so to do this, you would grind up litharge, which was actually a metallic compound. Then you would pour a little of it into a vessel or a flask, and then you would add to it 4 times the amount of lime. Then you would pour in fresh rainwater, just enough so that it covers them, stir it up, and then you would want to take your wool, clean it, and then put it into that mixture, and then leave it until it sort of takes in a deep yellow color. And then it says at the end, so that it appears as if this were natural and wonderful. So even though they're sort of just trying to dye wool here, even here you can see that there is that sort of idea of like, oh, you'll go ahead and do this artisanal process, and this will make the wool look as if it just naturally appeared like that. So you can even see some shades of sort of counterfeiting, or trying to sort of fool people into thinking that this is sort of a naturally occurring color for the wool, even though it is something that's been processed. So this is just one example of hundreds of recipes in these different papyri. But what is significant about them, again, as I said, is that they are implementing and using chemical procedures and operations. And in particular, what you see in these recipes is a really, really important chemical technique that is referred to as distillation. And so for those of you who have studied, have taken chemistry and studied distillation, you may know, what this is. But I want to just talk a little bit about what distillation entails. Basically, in distillation, what you do is you take a liquid, and oftentimes what you would do is you'd mix things together. You might dissolve something in a liquid, and then you take that liquid, you put it in a flask, and then you heat up the liquid. And what happens is that the different components of the liquid will vaporize, or will boil at different temperatures, because each thing has its own boiling point. And so you will have, again, the different components of the mixture of this liquid that will boil and then vaporize at different temperatures. And in this way, then you're able to separate out the different components of this liquid. So this is a relatively simple distillation apparatus where you can only kind of separate out one thing, because the idea is then once the different parts of the liquid reach their different boiling points, then they'll rise up into the top of the apparatus, and then there they'll cool and then re-liquefy, and then as you see that they'll go out into what's called the recipient. So this little sort of round vessel here that's collecting the distilled liquid then is called the recipient. So you'll again boil the liquid in a flask. Then as different components of the liquid reach their boiling point, they'll rise up in a vapor up to the top of the distillation apparatus. Then they'll cool, and as they cool, they'll then be shuttled off into that recipient, so that you could then collect what's called the distillate from that, so that you can again separate out different components of a liquid. So like I said, this is a relatively simple one where you're only able to pull off sort of one thing at a time, but you can see there were, well, I'll show you in a second, there were more and more complex distillation apparatus where you could then do several, have several different recipients that were collecting different parts of the liquid. So here, this is actually a drawing from the Hellenistic Roman period, from sort of the 3rd, 4th century CE, of an early distillation apparatus. And this is the kind of operations that they were doing in these recipes in the Leiden and the Stockholm papyri. So here's a drawing, and then here's another drawing. And here you can see, again, several different distillates being collected in several different recipients. And then I'll just show you, for those of you who don't remember this from chemistry, or hadn't taken chemistry, this is a modern distillation apparatus. And the reason why I'm explaining this right now is because, in such detail, is because it is one of the absolute key operations of alchemy and then later of chemistry. And it was considered to be a very, very powerful tool for alchemists to be able to separate out different parts of a substance. And so again, they would sort of liquefy it or add liquid to a particular substance, and then they were able to draw out different parts of that substance through distillation. So it was, like I said, it was a very powerful tool, and it also gets related to sort of mystical and religious ideas, because what alchemists argue sometimes, or I should say early on in these Hellenistic period and then in the medieval period and into the early modern period, they would argue that they were able to then extract the divine um, essence from a substance, or they would call it its ether, if you remember from the Aristotelian cosmology, or they would call it the quintessence, which again was another name for the ether, that fifth essence. And for those monists who were doing distillation, they believed that they were able to get back to that single substance that made up everything in the world, that was sort of, again, like a divine seed that was in each substance. So in that way, distillation again was had a lot of meanings for the people who were practicing it. In addition to the very practical meanings of, being able to. This was a means to be able to extract essential oils, say from if you've ever used essential oils like cinnamon oil or eucalyptus oil or camphor oil, those are things that are, very popular now, or clove oil. What you could do is you grind up clove or grind up cinnamon bark and then liquefy it, add it to a liquid, then distill it. Well, then you can, when you start to know at what temperature the oils in the cinnamon or in the camphor will boil, then you can collect it at that particular temperature, and then what you get is this super, super concentrated oil. So these are the kinds of things they were doing, and this was also used in perfumery and to make perfumes also. In ancient Babylonian culture, ancient Egyptian culture, they would actually distill perfumes too. And rose petals were often used to make rose oil and rose water through distillation. They had other means to do these kinds of things too, but distillation was major, and this is what becomes a major part of alchemy. Another operation that was developed by an early alchemist. She's sort of a mystical figure. We don't really know much about her, but it's a woman who was called Mary the Jewess, I think a Jewish woman. But again, it's sort of shrouded in mystery. We don't really know much about her. But she developed a way to heat things up very carefully and slowly. In what's called a water bath, which you can see here, where you would actually put the distillation flasks or any other flask in water and then heat the water. And that's actually a much more gentle way to heat things. If you've ever melted chocolate, for instance, you use what we call now a double boiler, where you put one pan inside another. The bottom pan has water, and then the top pan has the chocolate, and the water heats up. And then as the water heats up in the bottom pan, it melts the chocolate slowly so that it doesn't burn. Because if you try to melt chocolate and heat it directly, it's really easy to burn chocolate. So there's sort of modern aspects of this too. So anyway, she developed this method of heating carefully and slowly, and um, it's called the Maria bath, or the bain Marie in French, or the Baño Maria in Spanish, and then in English we call it a water bath. But that is it's said that this is what she she developed this technique. And again, you can see on the left-hand side there several different distillations going on at the same time in this water bath. And on the right-hand side, this very special kind of furnace with the flask and the water bath, and then again, a distillation being carried out with that too. So now I want to move on to sort of the birth of alchemy proper. So we've looked at, and I'll go through this table in just a minute. It's actually we'll sort of come back to it several times. But so I've talked about those recipes and how they were sort of for crafts, and that they did though, so those recipes weren't sort of alchemy proper, but they introduced a lot of techniques, especially distillation and then these special forms of heating with the water bath, that then would become very important to alchemy. And alchemy is considered to have really begun with a man named Zosimus, who lived in or around Alexandria, again, sort of 3rd, 4th century. And actually, let me show you a picture of him first, and then I'll go back to the table. Sort of again, a kind of a mystical figure, but here you can see him carrying out distillations and, liquefying things and looking at things in flasks. There's lots of mysticism associated with alchemy too. But Zosimus does appeared to be someone who did actually live and then left behind some writings that we can still read sort of fragments of and parts of. And he adopted an idea that comes from Aristotle that then becomes the basis for the field of alchemy. And so he could be considered sort of an early founder of alchemy. And that idea, so let me go back to my table here now, came from Aristotle. So Aristotle argued that metals in the earth were made from two different kinds of what he called exhalations, sort of these, I don't know, kind of airy emissions that sort of were come from deep, deep, deep within the earth. He said there was a mercury exhalation and a sulfur exhalation, and those came together in different what's the word, percentages or different amounts to form the different metals. So you have, say, lead, tin, copper, gold, silver. Each of those metals were considered to be different proportions of mercury and sulfur. And how he worked this out with his earth, air, fire, water, I don't really know. The metals seem to be different, and perhaps those exhalations are different, are made up of the earth, air, fire, water. I've never seen that sort of satisfactorily explained, but just think for our purposes that metals are a little bit different from other terrestrial substances for Aristotle. And again, they're made up of these two kinds of earthly emanations, these things he called exhalations. And again, they come together in differing proportions to make the different metals. And of the metals, there were what he called the base metals, which are kind of the regular not valuable metals, like, well, I shouldn't say they're not valuable, but they're not valuable like gold and silver. There are base metals like lead, tin, copper, iron. And then there were two noble metals, that was silver and gold. And the noble metals for Aristotle were made of a perfect proportion of mercury and sulfur, of purified mercury and sulfur exhalations that came together in an absolutely perfectly balanced way to produce silver and gold. And gold was considered the most perfect of all of the metals. And that was proven that if you tried to burn gold, it wouldn't burn and it wouldn't decompose into anything else. And that was considered to be because it was in such perfect proportions. And this underlies all of what comes with alchemy over the centuries to follow. Because with that idea, then, different metals were thought to be composed of the same thing. They were composed of proportions of mercury and sulfur, not in our modern sense of mercury and sulfur, but in an ancient sense of a mercury and sulfur exhalation. And that meant that if you could take lead and then somehow rework its proportions of mercury and sulfur, you could get gold. And that's called transmutation. They literally believed that metals, how can I say this? They were on a line of development from the base metals to the noble metals, but they were all composed of the same materials, just in different proportions. So that lead was not fundamentally different from gold in terms of what it was made of, which is how we understand it today. Um, at that time, metals were again thought to be on sort of a continuum of differing proportions of mercury and silver. Okay, Aristotle wasn't sort of proposing transmutation or things like this, but when you get to Zosimus, you see for the first time somebody not saying, I want to produce counterfeit gold or make, this tin. I'm not going to try to burnish this tin through using this recipe to try to make people think that I've produced gold. Zosimus actually started to teach that you could literally make gold. And what he said was that metals were composed of a body and then what gave them their form. So the matter, if you think back to the hylomorphism in the matter and form of Aristotle, the matter was made up of mercury and sulfur, and the form, I'm sorry, and that made the body of the metal for Zosimus. It was sort of mercury sulfur. And the spirit then was what gave it form and gave it its characteristics. It's what made gold have that golden sheen and be sort of indestructible and things like that. What Zosimus taught was that through distillation, you can separate the spirit from the body. Then you can purify and correct the spirit, sort of pull out the essence of the spirit through further distillation of the spirit, and then recombine it with the body, with the base substance of the metal. And at that point, because the spirit has been purified and balanced, once it's reunited with the body, you could produce gold. So you could have transmutation. So that's the basic set of ideas then that through the sort of Arabic translation movement that goes on through the House of Wisdom, they start to translate the alchemical texts as well, from the Hellenistic period and from the Alexandrian alchemists. The Arabic translators do. And you get two major alchemists then in the Arabic period who write quite a bit of literature on alchemy and particularly on the transmutation of gold, the transmutation of metals. And I should say, even though they really did want to try to make gold, in doing so, they utilized all sorts of chemical operations, but in particular distillation. But they also refined heating methods. They had all sorts of methods of filtration. If you've ever done sort of, you know, um, solvent extraction where you dissolve something and then through that you're able to extract certain parts of it. These are all sort of laboratory techniques. If you've ever been in a chemistry lab, these techniques then were further refined and developed by these Arabic alchemists. And the two major Arabic alchemists we'll talk about then are Jabir and Al-Razi. And so I'll come back to this table in just a second, but I just want to show you then. So here's some images of Jabir, and then his work I should say, his name then was later Latinized to Geber, or Geber. I'm not actually sure how you pronounce it correctly, but I'm going to call him Geber. Anyway, and then so it was Jabir, and then a man named Al-Razi. And Al-Razi was actually known for medical works as well, but he wrote a lot of alchemical texts as well. And so they lived sort of around that golden age, and they both were associated with Baghdad, sort of did research and did their writing in Baghdad. So Jabir lived in mainly in the 8th century, and then Al-Razi lived mainly in the 9th century, and then moving into the early 10th century. And each of them then further built upon that basis that Zosimus had set out with regard to transmutation. And then in trying to transmute gold, they end up developing all sorts of other laboratory techniques and then increasing the amount of materials that were being used and started distilling all kinds of things, not just metals, but organic materials as well. And then developing further the kinds of theories that went along with transmutation, but all still based on that idea that metals were made up of mercury and sulfur in differing proportions, and you just have to get that perfect proportion, and then you're going to have gold. So let me go back to, let me go back to the table and just talk a little bit about Jabir and what he taught, and then Al-Razi. So Jabir himself is another, not surprisingly, there's a lot of these in alchemy, a mythical figure. We're not even sure if there actually was a man named Jabir or if he just became sort of the stuff of legends. But there is an author named Jabir of hundreds and hundreds of very short alchemical texts that were produced over the course of about a century. And it appears that just like with the Hippocratic corpus, they weren't all written by him. There's probably a bunch of different writers. It's probably the production of a whole school of thought that he was probably the main sort of the head teacher, and then taught a bunch of students, and then they produced this corpus. But he is said to be the author of these, hundreds and hundreds of texts produced over a century. So it's actually impossible that he could have written all of them. But I will refer to those texts as just the Jabirian corpus, and we'll just attribute them to him, just like we did with Hippocrates, with the understanding that there's actually a lot of people contributing. But at any rate, Jabir, just like Aristotle, said that the substance of metals was the two exhalations of mercury and sulfur, and that mercury was sort of a wet, steamy exhalation. So you can start to see the application of the qualities of the 4 qualities here, the hot, dry, wet, and cold. So here we see a wet sort of steamy, meaning that it's a heated exhalation that's identified with the mercury, and then a dry, smoky, sort of the dry, fiery exhalation that's identified as sulfur. And that those two, again, come together to form metals. And then what Jabir said, he sort of builds on what Zosimus argues. He says that through distillation, you can actually isolate qualities from the metals, and this is where it might get a little confusing. So if this doesn't make sense, feel free to email me and I can help you with it. But it's this is also described and discussed in the chapter on Islamic alchemy in the Secrets of Alchemy book. But what he argued was that basically metals that weren't gold or silver were what he termed sick metals. They were not healthy, not in the sense of like a healthy body and things like that. But he used actually Galenic concepts, and he said that since the two exhalations in these metals were not balanced, that it was just like a sick body in Galenic medicine, because it had an imbalance of these exhalations, and then in addition to that, or as sort of a symptom of that, they had an imbalance of qualities. So they're too hot, or they have too much moisture, or they're too dry, or they're too sort of smoky and fiery. And so what you have to do is you have to take a substance and then isolate out a particular quality. So say you, and it could be any substance at all. So say that you take pepper, for instance. So we know that, say, pepper is hot and dry. Um, so what you do is you get something that's cold and wet, and you mix that with the hot and dry pepper. Or say that you take something that's just cold and you mix it with the hot dry pepper. Well, the cold will basically cancel out the hot, and then you'll be left with something that's dry and just purely dry. So he thought that you could actually purify qualities separate from their matter, in a sense, that you could have something that's purely hot or purely cold or purely wet or purely dry. And then you would formulate it in such a way. Oh, sorry, my dog. You would formulate it in such a way that you could then apply it to the metal and correct any imbalance within the metal in order to create a perfect balance so that it would form gold. So in that way, you would basically be forming a catalyst, a set of purified qualities that then you could apply to a metal that then would bring basically a balance of qualities to that metal. So you would determine, what the imbalance was within the particular base metal you were working with. Then again, you would formulate that catalyst just like a physician would formulate a medicine to apply to a diseased body that was imbalanced to restore balance. You would basically formulate a catalyst for a metal to make it so that it didn't have any imbalance anymore and would be perfectly balanced. And then the idea was you would have gold. Um, and then Al-Razi basically takes similar ideas to this, but he applies it to all kinds of different organic compounds, and he starts distilling all kinds of things. Hair was a big thing that they would burn it and then they would distill it, or milk, blood, urine. They would, bodily fluids would easily break down into different component parts. They were sort of mixtures of all different kinds of things. And if you distilled it, you would get all sorts of interesting, you know, um, basically what they thought interesting elements that, or I should say, interesting things would come out of these liquids that were considered by the alchemists to be basically earth, air, fire, and water. Say coming, you could separate out the four main elements of blood or milk, and then that way you could also then isolate their qualities and again use them as catalysts on the metals. And so you might be wondering if they applied these ideas, if alchemists started to apply these ideas to medicine, since they are really seeing metals as sort of parallels to the body and metallic imbalances similar to humoral imbalances. But the Arabic alchemists didn't. Um, they uh, they purely are still trying to transmute metals and in the process learning all kinds of things about what happens when you burn and distill hair. You get all kinds of interesting kind of chemical compounds from that. And they're really putting together a whole research agenda, and really sort of developing laboratory techniques, but we're still very much focused on trying to make gold. And the last thing I just want to say is that Al-Razi also adopted Zosimus's idea of the idea that metals are body and spirit, but that similarly you could correct the spirit, reunite it with the body in order to transmute gold, but again by correcting its qualities and then bringing about a perfect balance. So hopefully this makes sense. It's a lot of kind of variations on a central theme that base metals have imbalances of their basic components and then of their galenic qualities, of their galenic temperament or complexion. and that the way you get gold is by making a perfect balance. And so you also might be wondering, didn't they ever figure out that they weren't actually making gold? And that's a that's a hard question to answer, in the sense that why did people do this for centuries when they clearly couldn't ever have made gold? There were people that absolutely claimed left and right that they did make pure gold, and there were, I think they were able to fool people. I think probably by using those counterfeit kind of techniques. But and there were lots of practices, lots of recipes for how to bring a gold sheen to metals. So maybe they really did think that they had made gold, but clearly they couldn't. And later on, they are denounced as sort of charlatans and frauds, and they get into trouble later on. But this is just to sort of introduce some of these early ideas of alchemy. And again, I know this gets complicated, so if you have any questions about it, feel free to ask me. But let me move on now to the Western Caliphate and just go through that relatively quickly. But I just want to say one last thing about Al-Razi, which is he also was a physician who wrote some really important medical works as well, and did a lot with kind of clinical medicine, and wrote down a number of case histories. That may be one of the other things that he's best known for, his alchemy as well as his clinical medicine and his case histories. So just wanted to point that out. Although I really have kind of designated Avicenna or Ibn Sina as our kind of symbol of the medical advances. Um, Anyway, oh, and then I just wanted to show these images of Al-Razi as an alchemist holding up this flask um, in history. So let's move then to what was called the Western Caliphate, which consisted of North Africa and Spain, or what was known as Al-Andalus, under Islamic rule. And as I had talked about earlier, so going back to this map of the Eastern and the Western Caliphates, um, Spain, or I should say the Iberian Peninsula, had been then invaded by Islamic forces in 711 when they crossed the Straits of Gibraltar. Almost the entire peninsula was overtaken very quickly, and a Muslim presence, ruling presence, was in Spain then for the next 700 years, until 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella um, actually are able to conquer the last remaining kingdom in southern Spain and expel then the Muslim leaders from Spain. But you have a Muslim ruling presence in Spain for more than 700 years. And as you can imagine, what this Islamic presence brings to Spain, to the Iberian Peninsula, is great cosmopolitanism, sophisticated intellectual traditions, and so that Spain, where, let me back up. What we saw with the fall of the western part of the Roman Empire was that basically the level of learning declines as the Roman Empire fragments into all these different states, and a number of works were lost. A lot of Aristotle's works were lost. A few of Galen's treatises survived, but not many. Dioscorides did survive. There is some Neoplatonism in Europe, but for the most part, there's a real loss of many of much of the Greek natural philosophy and medicine. So with the Islamic presence in Spain, Spain actually gets kind of an injection of intellectual quality through the Islamic presence. Um, and you can see that in the Islamic cities that were established in Al-Andalus. And so that's what I'm going to focus in on now. This is sort of an area of my research, and I've actually spent quite a bit of time in southern Spain and Andalusia. The archives that I work in, some of the archives for my research are in the city of Seville in southern Spain. So like I've spent a lot of time there, and it's absolutely beautiful, an amazing history, and so I love it. So I wanted to sort of focus in on that to represent the Western Caliphate. So here's a map of Al-Andalus around 750, so just a few decades after the 711 invasion. And as I say here on the slide, note that there are a number of kingdoms up in the north that remain independent. They're able to sort of push back the Islamic rule and remain Christian. And that's going to become important for next week. But you can see some of the major cities in Al-Andalus of Toledo right there in the center, Cordoba, which becomes basically kind of the capital of Al-Andalus, further to the south, then Seville and Granada. Those are some of the major and long-lasting Islamic cities. The Lisbon and Badajoz, those areas further to the west, were actually conquered by the Christians relatively early. But Toledo, Cordoba, Seville, Granada, those remain under Islamic rule for centuries. So, as I said, the major cities of Al-Andalus then are Seville, Granada, Cordoba, and Toledo. And here's another sort of map where you can see all the major cities of Al-Andalus. And what the Islamic presence did was it made these cities into places of architectural wonder. And I'll show you some examples of that, of intellectual prowess, of economic development, I'll talk about in a minute, and multiculturalism. And you can still see the traces of this amazing artwork and architecture in these cities today. So I'll just show you some pictures of Islamic art that you can see all over southern Spain. It's full of geometric and floral patterns. The idea in Islamic art was not to try to represent the human form, because the idea was then you don't want to try to represent sort of Allah and Allah's perfection. And so you see these beautiful floral and geometric patterns in rugs, in textiles and weaving. There's also beautiful Moorish tile patterns. So there's widespread use of tile work and these interlocking patterns and beautiful architecture. This is a palace in Granada. So the Muslim peoples who invaded Spain were called Moors, and so this is a Moorish palace in Granada. If you haven't been there, I would recommend that you try to visit this place sometime in your life. It's one of the most beautiful buildings, I should say complex of buildings I've ever seen. It's not as impressive from the outside. The idea of Islamic architecture was to sort of have these kind of protective walls around it and then have the beauty on the inside, which you'll see. There's these rows of fountains everywhere, so you can hear the water tinkling, and it would sort of cool the courtyards, and all these very symmetrical gardens and beautiful, flowers and sort of bushes that are shaped into sort of regular symmetrical shapes. Here is similar fountains in Cordoba, and again, you can see that line of kind of these bushes. And this is the Alhambra. They also made a lot of use of reflecting pools that would reflect the beautiful architecture. And lots of, I should just say too, lots of use of very delicate, intricate stucco work, and they were especially known for the Moorish arches that were this horseshoe-shaped arch that they used in the architecture very beautifully. Here's an adaptation of Moorish architecture with the reflecting pool in a place that might look familiar to you if you've ever been to Balboa Park. This architectural style gets brought to the Americas through the Spanish Empire, and then up into what was Alta California, where we live today, as an architectural style called Spanish Colonial Revival that then used colonial architecture, which again was from Spain and really originated with the Islamic architecture. So if you go to Balboa Park, you can see Islamic styles there in Islamic history that have been adapted to the colonial period. But anyway, I think know understand what I'm saying. So here's another famous court in the Alhambra, the Court of the Lions, and you can see the beautiful stucco work and the beautiful arches. It's they're so intricate. It's called a lace pattern in the arches and the stucco work. So here's a close up of the arches and the stucco work. It's just stunning. Um, Anyway, and then here is an adaptations of the Moorish, that horseshoe arch that you can see, that I'm sure you know where this is. Now, there's a Christian element that's been added to this, which is that the bell tower at the center of the arches. That's a Christian addition to the Moorish, the Islamic architecture. But it's always interesting to see that and see the connections through world history this way. Um, and then here's also a use of the roof tile work from the Islamic patterns as well. Again, this is Balboa Park, the Museum of Man. But to the left of that is then again a Christian bell tower style. So anyway, so they're places of architectural wonder. These cities become places of economic development, the use of paper money, the through the Islamic empires, there all sorts of new commodities are introduced, like sugar and palm trees and rice. There's a huge amount of exchange of agricultural products that come through the Islamic empires that come into Spain. It's also a place of multicultural interchange, because you may have already started to think about this. Um, in the Islamic empires, there was a relative amount of tolerance for people of other religions, and especially for Christians and Jews, who the Muslims referred to as peoples of the book, because Muslims recognized that they um, that they shared some of the same prophets. Muslims also revere what Christians referred to as the Old Testament, or Jews referred to as the Torah, and the New Testament. And the Muslims just believe that the Quran is sort of the final and full unfolding of what was begun with these earlier works. So there was respect for, like I said, the Christians and Jewish people, and relative tolerance. People were not forced to convert to Islam. If they didn't convert, they had to pay a tax, which, they may not have liked, but they weren't being persecuted. They weren't being forced to convert, or they weren't being expelled. They weren't being, fed to lions or crucified. They were basically, for the most part, left alone as long as they paid their tax. And you could see that with the Nestorian Christians, the strong presence of the Nestorian Christians under the Abbasids. The fact that a number of those major translators, and that the caliph's own physician was a Christian, can show you that there was room and tolerance for Christians in these Islamic empires. If you were to ever continue on with the history of Spain later, you would see that the Christians don't act the same way, and are actually very, very intolerant of Jewish people and of Muslims. Once they start to actually regain control of the Iberian Peninsula, you start to see a major rise in persecution. So you don't see that once Christians start to take over. But under Islamic rule, Jews and Christians and Muslims lived in relative harmony. So there's a lot of multicultural interchange going on among these peoples. And then for our purposes, there's a lot of intellectual richness in this area as well. And I'm just going to go through some of the major physicians and philosophers of the Western Caliphate, and especially of the Iberian Peninsula and Al-Andalus. Beginning, I'm going to go sort of in chronological order, and these figures were mainly medical authorities, and especially tended to work a lot on pharmacology, or the study of medicinal substances. And particularly looking at, they translated Dioscorides' work, and then went about trying to identify the plants that Dioscorides named, and then actually end up expanding what even Dioscorides had written about. So let me start then with al-Zarawi, or his Latinized name is Abul Qasis. He was a physician who lived in Cordoba right around the year 1000. So a little bit, uh, almost a contemporary of Avicenna, of Ibn Sina, sort of right around the year 1000. And he wrote a really, really important treatise on pharmacy and surgery that became that was translated later into Latin and became very famous. And in it, he talks about a lot of the craft operations and the alchemical operations also, like distillation and then other kind of chemical processes. But he also had a lot of work on um, a lot of pharmaceutical work, and then also he wrote a treatise on surgery. And then here's an illustration of the surgical instruments that he talks about in his book, which was called the Kitab al-Tazrif, which means treasury of medicine. So I'm just going to do sort of brief overviews of each of these, so that we'll sort of talk about them kind of en masse. So as I said, around the time of al-Zarawi, the a translation, a Greek, actually I should say a Greek edition of, or Greek manuscript of Dioscorides de Materia Medica arrived in Cordoba, and actually nobody knew Greek. It's a little story, but nobody knew Greek, and so they couldn't read it, they couldn't translate it. So and I should say it had been sent by the caliph in Baghdad as sort of a gift to the Cordoba leaders, and so they write back saying we can't read it. So then he actually sends a monk who knows, a Christian monk who knows Greek and Arabic, and then that monk then translates it to Arabic. Well, then the physicians now have access to De Materia Medica, to Dioscorides' work, and like I said, they go about then trying to identify the different plants that he named, the medicinal plants, and then trying to record medicinal plants that he didn't name. And so you have that, you see that, and then they start to produce treatises themselves. So for instance, there's Ibn Wafid, who wrote a really important treatise on agriculture and on medicinal substances and agricultural techniques, but also talking about the medicinal powers of the plants that you would grow. And he actually brings together in his work on pharmacology, he brings together the work of Dioscorides. So Dioscorides often would include a lot of detailed botanical um, information about, say, plants. And then he added to it what Galen said about their qualities and basically their temperaments. To what degree were they hot, cold, wet, or dry? And so he actually brings that material together, the botanical qualities and then the temperaments together in like I said, a really, really important treatise. Again, he lived right around that year 1000. This is sort of when this I think you could call sort of a golden age in Andalusia. Then you have Ibn al-Baitar, who lived then about a century and a half later. He was from the southern city of Malaga, actually, and then he wrote an even bigger treatise. He's considered to be, what would you say, the most famous of all of the Islamic pharmacologists of the Western Caliphate. He put together a book on medicinal substances of over 1,400 substances, and it's considered to be the most complete treatment ever. There's also another scholar. Oh, actually, I'm going to go back to that earlier slide where I list them. There's another scholar, medical scholar, Ibn Juljul, who wrote a treatise on substances that were not named in Dioscorides' work. I couldn't find a picture of him. So he's, right along in this similar sort of dates as Ibn Wafid and al-Zahrawi, say right around 1000 CE, because I don't have a slide on him. And then the final scholar that I want to talk about is, let me go down to him now, is Averroes or Ibn Rushdi, who lived in the 12th century, a scholar from Cordoba. And he wrote a number of works in philosophy, some work on astronomy, also a major medical scholar. And what he really tried to do was to work out how to make Aristotle's natural philosophy fit within the Islamic religion and Islamic sort of theology. And he produced some major sort of master works on that. Um, Talked a lot about Aristotelian cosmology, and like Ibn Sina, is one of the major medical authorities for the Latin West, for the medieval Latin West, for Western Europe, once his work gets translated then to Latin. So that's just sort of kind of a brief overview of some of the major scholars of the Western Caliphate of Al-Andalus. And what we're going to then continue on with next week is, now that these works are being produced throughout the Islamic world, then they start to be translated from Arabic into Latin, and then sort of coming into Europe, especially Western Europe, where, again, there had been a real decline in learning, a loss of a lot of these works of Greek natural philosophy. Well, now they're able to have access to Greek and Arabic medicine and natural philosophy once they start translating these Arabic works to Latin. And that happens mainly in Italy, in a city called Salerno, and then in Toledo, Spain. So that's, again, what we're going to then pick up with next week, and then look at the impact of these major works and major scholars on Christian thinking in the sort of in the Latin West. So the last slide I just want to show you is a slide that shows what's called the Reconquest in the Iberian Peninsula, and that is basically over many centuries, those Christian forces in the north, the Christian kingdoms that hadn't been conquered by the Islamic forces, are able to push their control further and further south over time. So around 1000, in that top left map, you can see around 1000 CE, you see a strip along the north there. It's the kingdom, mainly the kingdom of Leon, Navarre, and then Barcelona. Those are Christian kingdoms. And then below that, you see it's the Caliphate of Cordoba. That's what it was called for a while. Just think of that as sort of, that's where the Islamic rule was, where the Umayyads were basically ruling. Then by 1100, if you move to the right, you can see that they've now captured Toledo, and they've sort of pushed further south. Then by 1212, in that next one down in the left-hand bottom corner, you can see where they are in 1212. They've captured Toledo. They're getting now closer to Cordoba, Seville. And then by 1300, they've now captured, the Christian forces have now pushed so far south that they've captured Cordoba and Seville, and now you only have one kingdom of Granada, and that's what's conquered in 1492. So with that reconquest and the reimposition of the Christian rule, that's when they discover and see all of this amazing work in Arabic, and they take the Arabic works to Toledo, to a major library, and they start to translate them to Latin. And then these Latin works reach the rest of Europe. So through Toledo, and then also, like, we'll talk about what happens in Italy next week as well. So that's where we're going from here. So that concludes the lecture on Islamic medicine and science. And then, as I said, next week we'll see where that goes from here.